friends, it's Cake Over Keto time, your non-diet podcast that invites all foods onto our table, unless it's mouldy or you nicked it maybe. Let there be no beratement, shame or guilt when we eat. I'm Mel Wakeman, registered nutritionist, intuitive eating practitioner, non-diet counsellor and lover of syrup, sponge and custard. I specialise in disordered eating and recovering from chronic dieting, body dissatisfaction and eating disorder recovery, all through a weight-inclusive lens. I am here to sit beside you and provide a safe healing space for those on their way to food and body freedom. Please keep your ears plugged in. What's coming up in this episode is right around the corner. In this episode, what to do with fearing fullness, I want to talk about how uncomfortable and challenging fullness can feel. Something that can evoke guilt, failure and panic and oh shit moment. Why did I do that? What's going to happen now? I'm so out of control. What am I going to have to do about this? Now, diet culture makes being full synonymous with eating too much, with greed. Being full apparently means weakness and failure. So when we feel that, we attempt to try and restore some control and avoid the regret we feel. And sometimes that can include physical pain and discomfort. So restriction seems a logical way forward. We are certainly told that's the answer. So cutting back gradually, sometimes cautiously, sometimes not, by food group, by not snacking, and by skipping meals. I'm full becomes the standard response to offerings of seconds or a pudding, or I've already eaten for invitations to share food at a time that perhaps doesn't fit in with your plan. And avoidance works, right? Well, not as much as we hope, because problems can arise. We forget what fullness really feels like because we don't allow ourselves to feel it. Apart from those times we lose that control that we painstakingly put in place. But we sure have an idea of what busted, bloating, painfully sick feels like. So fullness becomes something to avoid, despite it being an entirely normal sensation, one that humans are meant to feel because it means we are alive, but we fear it. In this episode, I dig into the fear of fullness and invite you to consider what might happen if you let go of that fear. And spoiler alert, it's all good, by the way. So get that kettle on and find a comfy spot. If you'd like to follow me on social media, please do. I'm on Instagram as me, Mel Wakeman, _RNUTR, and I'm on TikTok as Cake Over Keto. Feel free to drop me a message if you'd like to carry on the conversation or ask me anything, and I promise I will get back to you. See you in a second. Hindsight is such a wonderful thing, but when it comes to fullness, what if we didn't have a clue where the stop sign was, or what it even looks like? Or what if you're kind of stuck in the fuck it bucket and just don't care? Now, the penny often drops as you take that deep breath, taking that last mouthful, then dropping the spoon into the bowl or tossing away the empty packet, and you close your eyes and then, oh God, I've eaten too much. Why did I do that? And then someone really unhelpful might say, you should have slowed down, you know. It takes 20 minutes for your brain to register you've eaten. Which is, yeah, you know. But then you weren't thinking because you were so hungry, because that dinner was just bloody delicious, because you didn't in fact enjoy any part of that meal, but you just can't stand to waste food. So I want to say again, it's normal to overeat. I bet we've all done it at some point. Eating is not meant to be perfect, but if you're in a place where you are consistently overeating, feeling uncomfortable in your body and have a nagging, judgy voice in your head, perhaps it's time to investigate what might be going on. Because not overeating isn't just telling yourself you're going to stop sooner. Because where is that point? You need something tangible to grasp. And yeah, you can't ask anyone else yet, hey, am I full yet? Although we probably know someone who is convinced that they have that skill. So slowing down and being more mindful certainly may help. But again, what sign are you waiting for? And this can be really tricky to do when your nervous system or you are emotionally dysregulated. So I'm going to begin with what fullness physically feels like, which you may think is kind of has an obvious answer. I mean, it would just go something like, well, I just feel full, like I've had enough or more than enough. So next I want to ask you, how do you know that? Is there a signal you are aware of, something that you notice, or is it coming from a place of, I shouldn't eat anymore? So I wonder what physical sensations you might notice in your body. And, this answers could be something like, well, I feel heavy in my stomach, bloated. My tummy feels stretched. I kind of feel lethargic, like I need a rest, and I have to undo my jeans. Do any of these resonate with you? And if I was to ask you, okay, so where do you feel it in your body? And some of those descriptions have been around your tummy, but you might say, well, fullness is lower down in my tummy, kind of, like a pressure, a heavy feeling compared maybe to an empty feeling that's higher up when I'm hungry. And it may include feeling kind of sick, pressure in your throat. You might feel a bit spaced out, headachy, and also add in the emotions of perhaps regret and guilt. So it's not uncommon for us to have actually quite a pretty good idea as to what very full or overfull feels like. Just like you can probably tell me what it feels like when you're bloody starving. But what about these more subtle signs? Because fullness signals, just like hunger, don't just come from your stomach. So let me share some signs that you may not have considered or noticed before. You may find your meal gets less tasty. You sort of kind of recognize that you're just not enjoying it as much, but you're maybe just carrying on and going with the flow. So a suggestion is try pausing in the middle of eating and asking yourself how your food tastes. Do you feel more content? Is there a sense of warmth or comfort or a sense of relief when you eat, even if it's just momentary? And I'll come on to the anxiety and guilt in a bit. Do you think less about food? Perhaps in terms of when you're going to eat and deliberating what you're going to have for most parts of the day. Is your energy restored somewhat? Does your brain seem to function better? Does your mood shift? So maybe write a list down and see if that helps you. So now I want you to think about the associations you have with fullness. So I mentioned kind of the influence of diet culture, but I wondered, do you ever get a sense of satisfaction? Do you know what that feels like? Do you ever feel content? Or is it more uncertain and panicky? Have I had too much? Are you telling yourself what's going to happen now, that this is bad? And what are you feeling the need to do now as a result? And that maybe, weigh yourself, go exercise, purge. So I want to make it really clear. You are not a bad person for eating too much. Which leads me on to, what stories are you telling yourself about eating, quote unquote, too much? Now, I've spoken a little about this in episode 2, What Lies Beneath the Number on Scale. So go and check that out if you haven't listened already. But it's where I speak about living in a culture that glorifies thinness, where we are bombarded with messages that say thin or lean is better, it's healthier, it's more wanted, acceptable, you're lovable, hey, you're disciplined and successful if you're slim. And on the flip side, fat is not healthy or attractive, wanted or disciplined. Fat is judged and fat is shamed. So when we internalize these totally untrue messages, by the way, they become our own truth. That we are not deserving or worthy of happiness or to enjoy good food. And we are not good enough if we can't control what we eat. So weight gain is seen as the worst thing that can happen to us. Which means many folk repeatedly strive for this culturally celebrated thinness. no matter what it takes. The behaviours we are told to engage in. So diet culture says dietary restriction, cut out food groups, eat less, exercise in a way that counts. These simply reinforce the idea that weight gain is wrong, something to be feared. And we call this fat phobia. And it can be directed at ourselves just as much as it can be at others. So when we do engage with anything that could potentially lead to weight gain, we experience a whole host of difficult emotions because all our emotions are attached to those kind of beliefs and behaviours around food, which drives the need to ignore those difficult emotions and try to obtain some sense of control, hence the self-destructive behaviours. And so the cycle gets pushed round and round and round. So when you eat, quote unquote, too much, and that often is based on what you perceive is too much. So yeah, based on what you've been told is too much by society or other people that aren't you, this can be very subjective. And when you see your stomach get bigger, you go into panic mode, your anxiety sets in, and what we can do is assume that you've gained a significant amount of weight, which you won't have done, but that's kind of the distortion that goes on. So you feel disgusted because the story you tell yourself is, I shouldn't have let this happen. How did I let this happen? And you may feel out of control and your anxious brain catastrophizes what's happened. And so you kind of go into that spiral of fearing not being able to stop eating, fear of becoming fat or fatter, becoming unwell, missing out on life, dying even, which opens the door to even greater efforts to control, often through restriction. And this is typically what can drive a binge eating cycle. And through this, we can kind of develop a conditioned bias when it comes to eating. And what I mean by this is, so let's say, for example, I decide to cut out bread. Okay. I have, and these are the thoughts that I used to have. I've been good, quote unquote, all week, having eaten no bread for the last 5 days. But then my mother-in-law brings me a freshly baked tiger loaf, one of those kind of long white bloomers with crusty, stripy, crispy outsides. And oh my God, it smells amazing. And it's still warm. And I have butter in the fridge. And the compulsion to tear off the end and stuff it into my mouth gets stronger and stronger. My stomach noises got ridiculous. Now, usually if my tummy rumbled, I thought I was doing good because, not eating, you're in control, weight loss, blah-de-da. But even so, I felt compelled. I decided to cut the end off, put the rest of the bread away, slap on a bit of butter. Oh my God, I'm in heaven. God, I want some more. Shall I, shan't I? So I get the bread out again, cut another chunk, put it away, slap on the butter. I'm eating quickly because it's bloody delicious, but I'm also feeling guilty about it. But the compulsion keeps growing and I keep eating, even though I've kind of recognized I don't want any more. And half a loaf down and my brain wakes up and it's like, ugh, ooh, the heaviness, probably from half of a loaf in my belly, and the kind of the butter that's kind of stuck around my mouth now, and the regret of what I've done. My belly aches. I feel sick a bit from all the butter, and this feeds into the story in my head that bread is bad. And because I've eaten bread, which is bad, I am a bad person. But I also think, oh, hang on a minute, oh God, bread bloats me out. And it tends to make me focus, or it made me focus more negatively on my tummy, because that was like one of my problem areas. And thanks to my distorted perception of myself, my conclusion was I shouldn't eat any more bread. And the solution to make up for my stupid mistake was to cut back even more. I didn't connect those unpleasant feelings with the restriction at all. It was all about the bread. And that made sense, right? So I ate the bread, I felt shit. So don't eat the bread. So we can get caught in that cycle, which can be quite difficult to break. So you may or may not have some sense of truth that, bread is okay. It's not bad. But the reality for me was, well, when I eat half a loaf of it quickly, I don't feel good. But my anxious brain just went, shit, don't do that again. And the restriction comes back in until my next blowout, by the way, and the cycle repeats. And these sorts of things can really mess with our digestive system, the restriction and the binging, the not eating enough, the inadequate fueling, and what we call functional gut disorders, where we get symptoms like bloating, pain, IBS type symptoms, but there's nothing physically wrong with your gut. There's no known cause of symptoms. And God, I had tons of investigations. But functional gut disorders are really common. Like at least 75% of people with disordered eating and eating disorders experience them. And in part, they're psychosomatic. And I don't mean it's all in your head, because the brain really has a significant influence over our digestion. So if we think something is bad and it's going to make us unwell, and that might be, because we've eaten too much or it's high calorie, high fat, if we feel anxious, then the likelihood is that digestion will be disrupted because our fight and flight response kicks in, adrenaline flows around, and that's just not conducive to the whole rest and digest thing. But also when we restrict, what tends to happen, in terms of kind of intentional weight loss measures is our body's metabolic rate slows down to compensate. Our body doesn't know when it's going to get fed again. And so our gut activity also slows down. So what happens is your stomach and your intestines are not given any maintenance work. They're not given the stuff to repair with because there's nothing really, it's not enough to go round because of the lack of food. And it just stops working so efficiently. It becomes quite disrupted. And the muscles in the digestive system slow down. And in part, that kind of helps as food moves through the digestive system. The body has a bit more time to obtain as much nutrition as possible out of the food. But when food empties very slowly from our stomach, there's like a food retention effect. We call this gastroparesis. It's like a slower rate of gastric emptying. It can make you feel overly full. You can simply feel bloated and nauseous and uncomfortable, even for a long time after eating, because your gut has just become really sluggish. And then you can become constipated due to that, which can also contribute to your uncomfortable experiences, as can fluid retention, altered gut bacteria, and temporary food intolerances that can all present when we don't fuel and nourish our body enough. So if we associate all of this discomfort with eating, well, why the hell would we want to do more of it? And this is the challenge in terms of our healing journey and ultimately restoring trust with food and our own body. Even though it makes sense in theory to cut back more when we experience these things, eating more erratically, eating smaller portions. So when we eat, we only eat just enough to turn off the hunger, but not actually feel full. We never get to sense proper emerging fullness. It's all or nothing, meaning our emerging fullness signals, the ones I was talking earlier in terms of, meal gets less tasty, those sorts of things, they go underground, they go unused, unnoticed. So we forget what fullness feels like. And, you might notice if you adopt a grazing approach in terms of minimizing food quantity, that your hunger returns really quickly. And, well, it would, wouldn't it, if you haven't eaten enough? But that can really kick off your anxiety even more. It feeds into this cycle where you kind of go, I can't be hungry already. I've just eaten, which adds to this sense of loss of control, cue for more restriction, anxiety, feeding the cycle. So, yeah, all of this understandably makes establishing a regular and adequate eating pattern difficult. I get that. But the key is still going to be eating enough and eating regularly. Despite the discomfort, which we need to remind ourselves is because we are human and it will pass, we have to continue to eat. Continue to eat. We need to drink enough fluids, but don't tend to try not to have too much at the start of a meal. That's one of the messages we're told, isn't it? In terms of, if you're not sure you're hungry, if you're hungry, just have a glass of water, fills you up. So it can be really confusing if we're in that habit of drinking too much fluid around meal times, because it can give you a false sensation you are full. Find ways to relax before you eat. Find gentle distractions for afterwards so you don't tend to dwell too much on your experience. And really consider working with a professional to help you choose appropriate foods for treatment that could perhaps lessen some of the GI symptoms or digestive symptoms that you're experiencing. Now, eating too much will mean different things to different people. So remember, there are no rules here apart from continuing to eat. Keep going, and try to keep the compassionate lens close to yourself. And it's really vital we retrain our responses to hunger and fullness. It's such an important and worthwhile part of recovery. So I've got a few questions here maybe you could use to help you explore the process and ultimately let go of any guilt around eating or overeating. So number one, be honest, brutally honest with yourself. Is it possible that your body needed more food? Sometimes we just have hungrier days for no reason. Sometimes we forget we didn't eat as much the day before, or we moved our body more, or we slept badly. You don't need to have an answer every time. So try to let go of the idea you should eat in a certain way. But even though we're focusing on fullness here, we have to consider the hunger aspect and what you're actually putting into your body as part of the picture. In terms of overeating, did you have an unmet need that wasn't addressed? And you may have no idea what that need is, which is okay, or you may have some kind of inkling. And it's at these times where we have to kind of face our fears. And it may just mean you needed a break, and perhaps you missed some of your basic self-care, or were you trying to distract from or numb out from something difficult? And the shift in perspective here is that eating can be the clue rather than the problem to help you work out what was missing for you. Number 3, is it possible that you went too long since eating your last meal? So in these situations, you tend to become kind of urgently hungry, and it's really easy to eat very quickly and just not give your body a hope in hell. And you bypass all the signals and you bypass the comfortable fullness. And then you end up in that uncomfortable place again. Number 4, were you connected to your body and the experience of eating when you overate? Or were you disconnected and checked out? Because if you deem eating as wrong or bad, and you want to bypass the feeling of guilt or shame, it's typical that you can kind of disengage. It's like you become disembodied, almost like an out-of-body experience when it comes to eating. Number 5, really think openly here. What can you learn from your experience? Now, this might be a single meal time. Learning from your experience is not a failure. It helps you let go. And lastly, what would you say to your dearest friend or your most loved pet who was struggling in a similar situation or just feeling really bad about themselves? What would you say? And say that to yourself. So I hope these make you think. It's okay to be curious. So why not save this episode or save these questions and try journaling them when you can? Overcoming your fear of fullness helps you break the cycle. It gives you peace and freedom without costing you your physical and mental health. It calms the forever food preoccupied brain. It allows you to participate in life and enjoy the things you deserve to enjoy. That's the good stuff that's worth fighting for. Now, don't go anywhere just yet. My pick and mix is back, albeit a very small one. In this episode, I mentioned possible food intolerances. And so I want to kind of air the pick and mix bag of shame, because I feel it's important to tell you that food intolerance tests, although seen as, a good or easy option, believe you me, I know, then they can be very dodgy. And I'm not questioning here going to a qualified allergist or immunologist to get properly tested with valid and reliable tests. I'm more talking about purchasing the rather expensive online ones, the pop through the post tests that use blood, hair, saliva, and breath responses. Because the truth is, food sensitivity, I'm not talking allergies here, has no standard medical definition. It is not a medical diagnosis, despite the fact that they can make you feel totally shit. But these tests promise to cure IBS symptoms, to prevent weight gain, to stop chronic pain and asthma. But they are not standardized. They are rarely consistent in their findings or reflect your current state. And the worrying bit for me is the results can absolutely feed into your disordered relationship with food. That I also know personally. Now, I've got an explainer video that's less than 3 minutes, and I'm going to put the link to it in the show notes. It's over on my Instagram page. So go check that out. I hope that's just helpful, because I know the temptation is to maybe, not do the work on ourselves. So that's it for this episode. Thank you so much for joining me. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe so you don't miss what's coming up. The next episode is on the sticky topic of Halloween sweeties or candy. Do they fill you with horror, or are you a sucker for a bag of tricks and treats? Don't worry, there won't be any puns. Sorry. Anyway, if you'd like to carry on the conversation, please email me at mel@weightbluenutrition.com, or come find me on Instagram or TikTok, as I'm back on there too. Okay, so take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time. Bye.
This has been a Monkey Pants Productions podcast.